This debate is brought to you from Brand Africa Forum by Brand South Africa.
Welcome back to Brand Africa 2011. Let's now continue with the panel discussion on the role of sustainability and governance in building country brands.
Mr. Motala, nation branding has got two main aspects: to increase tourism flows and to increase investment into the country. In light of Ghana boasting 14% GDP growth, how does South Africa frame its investment case, its investment proposition going forward?
Well, the aim of nation branding for us obviously has ultimately a socio-economic development outcome. The two that we have mentioned, investment and tourism, are just amongst some of them, but it's also about creating markets for our exports. It's also attracting skills and talent. People might want to see this as a reputable brand and a country that they would like to live in. Now, with respect to your question, how do we frame our investment case or our proposition? Yes, the reality is that those countries you've mentioned are coming off a very low base in terms of the growth that you're seeing. But we are able to frame our proposition around the very issues that I talked about earlier, the governance infrastructure. In terms of, for an example, South Africa's performance in terms of some of the key areas or categories of the competitiveness index that are important for investors, whether it's in terms of accounting standards, where we are amongst the first, whether it's in terms of protection of property rights, or whether it's in terms of things such as the accountability of our private institutions, where we sit at about number 3 globally, the issue of our financial market development, we sit at about number 4. So we are still able to make a very compelling investment case, because you do know that the returns might at this stage not be as high, but you are guaranteed obviously that the information, whether it's financial information that you get, is very sound. Our securities exchange is, for example, considered the first, number 1 in the world. And so there are very solid pointers that we can highlight as putting South Africa forward as an investment nation. Lastly, it's also our strategic positioning as an almost a services hub into the rest of the continent as a result of exactly what I said, the issue of our for sophistication of our financial markets and other institutions. But it's also the policies that we are putting in place as part of our governance infrastructure, whether you're looking at policies in terms of the new growth path, which is very clear about where the opportunities lie and the kinds of sectors that we would give support to as a country. Lastly, I would like to mention also our industrial policy action plan, the second revised, which is very clear about industrialization, giving support to industries that are maybe in decline as a way of ensuring that we can ultimately also create jobs, but create opportunities for investors to come into the country. So from the perspective of governance infrastructure, putting those things in place and our performance in terms of the key competitiveness indices that are relevant for investors, we have a solid case to make.
Okay, thank you. While we're still on South Africa, I'd like to come to the IDC. So the IDC is a multi-billion rand institution. You fund projects in South Africa and in parts of the continent. So at a time when other investors were reducing their exposure, the IDC continued to invest. How do you leverage the power you have? Because you've got a lot of power. So when you lend, do you also stipulate changes in those organizations, structures, governance? How do you leverage the money you have to ensure better governance on the continent? And how is it received? Do people like loans with no strings attached? And how does that work?
Maybe to start with your comment about we continue to invest and in some cases grow our investment. I mean, that was a very deliberate strategy. When the West was facing its liquidity crisis, there were pressures on investment, and we very consciously took a counter-cyclical role to make sure that funds continue flowing. When we invest, we want to see a long-term sustainable investment. We want to get a financial return for ourselves, but we also want to make a development impact, create the jobs, have a positive impact on the local communities and so on. For that sustained impact, there need to be proper structures in place, proper governance. So we would, in fact, put requirements in place, and that could cut across things like making sure that the funds that are generated through profits. A certain proportion are retained in the business and are invested, which are in the interest of the company and the country concerned. We try to encourage the management structures to be in place properly. So strong management, supported by a strong governance structure, appropriate boards, maybe an independent chairman, and so on. We'd look at things like environmental behavior of the company. We'd look in a similar light at a range of different behaviors. And where necessary, we'd put some of these as absolute requirements before we'd consider investing. And it's often received negatively, but not in all cases. In fact, the more responsible companies and the companies that are serious about the investment often welcome the inputs that we make because they can see the benefits to themselves in the long term. We also try to relate to the local communities, to the local government, to the local financial institutions, and so on, to see how they can be drawn in. And in terms of making sure that the governance structures take them into account as well, so that they can see the benefits as well. Where we turn down investments, and we do that often, it's not just about financial returns, it's about often that we are seeing that the type of investment that is planned is not going to have the type of long-term development impact that we would like to see. And that does lead to conflict at times, but that's the reality of the world.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll come to Sulvia Mwichuli from Agra. What impact does food security have on Africa's reputation, competitiveness, and growth?
Yeah, I just want to say that food insecurity has impacted Africa very negatively. And I think most of you have seen repeated images of very emaciated, very desperate looking, dying Africans. I think you just saw these images during the recent crisis with the Horn of Africa. And what we have to understand is that we cannot be able to build a strong African brand without addressing this fundamental question. And understanding that these images, when you have something good happening in Africa, it's never broadcast on CNN and other places. When you have something like what's happening in the Horn of Africa, these images are everywhere. If you go to Greenland, anywhere, people have heard about this crisis. So we need to understand that this is very critical to the agenda that we have here today. And to be able to do this, we have to first, going back to what Dr. Mtabara said, to believe that we can make a difference and we can do something. As Africans, we have to believe that we have the capacity, the capability, the skills, the resources to be able to change this mindset. But beyond this is at a personal level to address some of the challenges we have in terms of our own perceptions that affect this brand. And the perceptions are 5 in number. The first is that we generally believe as Africans that agriculture is not a viable business. If you go to the villages, people are all trying to get back into the cities. Young people are not interested in agriculture because they don't believe it's a viable place to have a career. The second is that, generally speaking, agriculture is not considered a career. And if you go out and talk to people in school, they all want to get jobs in banks, in private sector, very prestigious kind of careers. And we have to address this fundamental issue because if our young people are not getting into agriculture as a career, where is the sustainability going to be? The other issue is that people believe that agriculture equals poverty. And generally speaking, the attitude is very, very poor. And this affects in return how the whole brand of Africa is seen. And then 2 more issues, that agriculture is very high cost and very high risk. Now, what we are saying as Agra is that until the day when agriculture is seen as a viable business, and that is why we need a greater participation by private sector in this space, until people start to realize that we have to take care of our land and ensure that all Africans do not go to bed hungry, that people have food to eat, we cannot even begin to discuss having a strong development agenda. So this is very, very critical. Our brand as Africa is largely dependent on how we deal with this issue of food insecurity. Thank you.
Okay, so given that food security is important, it's a life and death issue, in fact, what, in your view, should governments, African governments, be doing to promote the agricultural sector? And the reason I ask this is because there are so many barriers. So what should they be doing from a policy response? And the barriers include, for example, lack of security of tenure. So you're speaking with land rights, which is a big issue. It's an emotive issue as well in a lot of African countries. Small access, lack of access to capital. Small farmers, lack of access to markets. And also, how do you capacitate small-scale farmers to become large-scale commercial farmers. So how do governments address these barriers?
Actually, from the point of view of Agra, the best way to address the whole challenges facing governments and even individuals involved in agriculture is taking a value chain approach where you look at all the factors that actually are game changers in this whole process. So you look at the whole issue of the input sector. What are the inputs that farmers need to be able to ramp up their productivity, and look at what are the innovative ways these inputs can get to smallholder farmers. It's interesting to note that across the continent, millions of farmers do not even have access to good seed. Millions of farmers do not have access to fertilizer, even if it's organic fertilizer that you're talking about. Millions of farmers do not have access. So you have to look at how you provide access across the input chain. The second area you have to look at is the whole issue of markets. How do you ensure that whatever grows gets to a market? It is very, very heartbreaking, like what is happening right now in Zambia, where there's been a huge bumper harvest, and in Malawi as well. And farmers their maize is rotting in their sheds. So the whole issue about how you get access to markets, and the way to do this is, one, to look at the infrastructure that is involved with getting the farmers to the markets, and also looking at the whole issue of market information supply to these farmers. In many cases, farmers don't have information about where they can sell, how they can sell, and who are the potential buyers. And then finally, you have to look at the whole issue of the policy arena. And in the policy arena, there are quite a number of things that are negatively impacting the food security arena in Africa. The first is around the policies with respect to the inputs. There are very retrogressive policies that are present right now with respect to the seed environment, the whole issue of access to what you call foundation seed, which is the seed that is used by private sector companies to multiply and grow seed. The second issue is very retrogressive issues around fertilizer. Many governments have got policies that actually do not make it possible for people to get access to fertilizer. And the whole trade environment, very, very retrogressive trade policies that make it difficult for one country to trade with another. I'll give you an example. In Tanzania right now, there's a bumper harvest in southern Tanzania, which is on the border to Kenya. Right across the border in Kenya, people are dying of hunger. But because the government has instituted an export ban, it's impossible for the farmers in southern Tanzania to reap from the benefit that could easily come from just exporting across the border. So there's a lot that needs to be done on issues of land tenure, which really impacts women negatively. Millions of smallholder farmers in Africa are women, and they do not have the right to the land that they farm. And this has a very, very negative impact. So there's a lot to be done to unlock the potential of this sector. Thank you.
So it's interesting that we're talking about agriculture, but it touches on so many things.
Yes.
Gender rights, land rights.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's quite complex.
It's very complex. Right.
Coming to Professor Mkandawire, in your previous capacity, you headed up CADUP, which is the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program. I'm wondering, what would you like to see coming out of COP17? And the reason I ask this is because climate change is a huge threat. And agriculture is one of those that is directly impacted. So what resolutions, from a policy perspective, would you like to see emerge from Durban this year?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think we need to recognize that this is an African COP.
Yes.
And as an African COP, it cannot actually ignore agriculture. I think it would be absolutely fundamental that, Africans there, render a voice to, speaking to how, climate change impacts negatively on the agriculture sector, on how smallholder farmers are impacted upon negatively. And therefore, they need to raise issues about how, mitigation and adaptation interventions can be put in place to address the impacts of climate change on agriculture. But I think equally important, I think it's important that, they speak very strongly to financing. Those who are responsible for greenhouse emissions, those who are the sinners, they need, I think, to pay for those sins. Africans, yes, have a responsibility also to attend to the challenges of climate change, but clearly financing is critical. Obviously one would hope that these issues can be put on the table there, yeah.
Okay. But it almost seems to me that the response to climate change there are almost two sets of responsibilities. So there's the one which is sort of run by the UNFCCC under the Convention of the Parties, COP 17. And at that level, we're talking about big issues. We're talking about dirty energy, clean energy. How does Africa fund clean energy? What is the energy mix in different countries? And that's quite a complex debate, but also it talks about big monies. But there's also a policy response that needs to come from African governments themselves. Planting more trees. Like you go into rural Africa now, and it's very sad. People are cutting down trees every day for firewood. Nobody's replacing those trees. You see riverbeds completely dry. People literally walk across what used to be rivers. And it's very apt to have this discussion this week, being the week that Professor Wangari Maathai has passed on. It's very sad. But how do governments begin to do things that they can do? So let's ignore climate change, 10 billion to build new clean power stations. Why aren't governments just planting trees?
No, I think there's no question. I think first and foremost, it's important that national governments put in place their own policy frameworks around climate change. There are not too many of our governments which have policies around climate change. And beyond that, I think it's important that those who are technicians create this awareness across the board. I mean, from decision makers to farmers to ordinary citizens on the impact of climate change on their own lives, in their own communities. This awareness raising is important because unless there's a real push from the grassroots to decision makers in addressing these issues, our governments are unlikely to really take these matters seriously. This is where, again, I think civil society organizations play a very important role in inducing governments to really take, certain policy decisions around, agroforestry, including planting trees, around, conservation agriculture, and other, smart climate change agriculture interventions. Civil society organizations need, I think, to increasingly play an active role on these issues.
Okay. Back to Ghana again. The other day, I spoke to a friend. I hadn't spoken to her for 20 years, and we reconnected on LinkedIn after 21 years since high school. I am that old. And I said, oh my gosh, Zambia is really exciting. It's one of the 10 fastest growing economies according to the forecast of The Economist. What an exciting time. And she said, really? I didn't know that. Life is so difficult here. So how do you, in your position, begin to reconcile these stats and that we read in the books and, with how people in Ghana actually live their lives? How do you bridge that gap?
It's a lag effect. I think once you start putting your macroeconomic policy frameworks in place, once you go down to getting the right investments in the focused sectors, once you get the skill mix together, then you'll start to, as we put it in Ghana, to feel things in your pocket.
So if I come to Ghana in 30 years' time, people will be feeling things in their pockets?
We are certainly not going to
I'll give you 30
take
years for the
30-year agenda. But let me say this. Last night we were talking, and I just remembered that the government invests close to 35% of its annual budget in education. That's a huge investment, with the view of producing people with skills, particularly in science and technology. But at the moment, we are challenged because many of those investments are not paying off because the population has grown to a certain extent, because we have different attitudes and behaviors of those who are responsible for implementing. So the surprise your friend expressed is not surprising to us. However, there are some clear indications. In the social sector, for example, there's been considerable investment in schools and health. What we're having a challenge with that will give a lag effect is the economic infrastructure. Because with this kind of growth, it's important to open the way, to have the roads, the ports, the airports, the railways, etc. So as you may be aware, Ghana has been shopping around with international investors, and we have, the president agreed a 13 billion package, of which we've had the first tranche approved of 3 billion, with the Exim Bank of China, with the China Development Bank, to provide that very infrastructure. So we're talking about transforming the economy. And it's like building a house. You can't occupy the house until you've actually built it. And what we are seeing is that the battle to transform the way the economy is structured in Ghana is about reducing the gap between the rich and the poor. We have to be very mindful of the fact that there's certain types of investment will only concentrate on consumption. And we are seeing this. For example, we've noticed that, as you know, the crisis, the global crisis in Europe, in my view, is largely led by consumption. Financed through a long period of easy access to finance and loans, where now you've got this group, which I think are commonly described as pigs. That's Portugal, Ireland, Italy, I think Greece and Spain, who have found themselves in this critical position because of consumption.
In the pits.
You see. And that's a result of quickly feeling it in your pocket.
Yeah.
And so we are being quite cautious, as it were, to titrate the availability of cheap funds on the market to avoid that rush to consumption. Consumption means more imports, less manufacturing, and so on. So I think South Africa, as part of the BRICS, and you can see that if you look at the patterns of consumption versus investment in countries like China and so on, it's quite different to what we're seeing in South Africa. And that may be the challenge. So it's all about really investment, deep investment, versus immediate consumption. And I think that is where we are trying to go in Ghana to be able to make it possible for a longer term approach, a longer term understanding, so that gradually people will feel it in their pockets across the board, right down to our grandmothers in the village.
In 30 seconds, can you tell me, why is beneficiation so difficult? Because there is money, you know, like I don't get it. Like, why can't we just be building more factories and producing and creating jobs? We've been talking about it forever. Why isn't it happening?
Because we don't drive our own agendas.
Who's we?
As Africans. It's every country around the world, every continent is looking after its own interests. They want to create the jobs at home. It's the easiest to come into Africa, take out the resources, take it back home, and create the jobs over there, add the real value in those countries.
But having said that, we have what the world wants. Why are we not determining the investment case, the investment conditions?
It's partly our faith in ourselves, our capabilities to do that, and we do have the capabilities to do a lot more than we are doing. And we tend to then rely on foreign expertise to make some of those decisions. It's also, we want to attract that investment, but we're scared of frightening people away by setting conditions.
But they won't go anywhere because all the stuff is here.
Exactly. So
all the platinum is here, so there's nowhere else to go.
Exactly.
We need to leverage that.
We need to leverage that and set the conditions under which we want to have that investment. As I said earlier, we're not victims. We need to be masters of our destiny. And
for once, we're actually in charge.
Sorry?
For once, Africa is actually in charge.
Yeah.
But we perhaps are not quite realizing it yet.
We're not realizing it and we're not leveraging it.
No, we're not. Africa going forward, how would you like to see it positioned?
Your previous question, you asked me what can South Africa or African countries learn from the Central European countries? I really would reframe that and completely turn it around and say, well, what can those countries learn, particularly from South Africa? Specifically, if you compare the fantastic branding that South Africa did around the 2010 FIFA World Cup, which was a great, sustained, strategic campaign that many stakeholders bought into, and I think was very beneficial for South Africa's image. Compare that to the almost non-existent branding that is being done by Poland and the Ukraine for next year's European Football Championships, which within Europe is almost as big an event as the FIFA World Cup. The branding literacy is just not visible from those countries, but they could have looked to the International Marketing Council of South Africa and really drawn some very useful lessons.
Okay. Last word from an African, not a foreigner.
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, I wanted to stress the point around why not the beneficiation. It seems to me that we have to pay close attention to globalization and the international markets. You see, the crisis that we're experiencing today calls for a better interface between politics and business. In other words, the visionary dream that we have has to manifest itself in the marketplace. The marketplace must not and cannot be allowed to make it purely profitable to extract raw materials from Africa from today. Let's make a commitment that will take a longer term view, because profits are profits. The only difference is that sometimes you have profits today, but you can delay the profit and think about tomorrow. And I think that is really the fundamental direction in which we need to go. So the politicians, and I'm very mindful of being a politician here, have to find a way of interacting more forcefully, I would say, with more power with the international business community and the market to be able to mitigate some of those market failures that themselves are a spectrum. You know, sometimes we talk about market failure when it's a catastrophe, but market failures are also an indication of some of these untenable conditions that we find in Africa going forward with just exporting raw materials with no value addition.
That's a very nice, sustainable last word to end on. So the message is, as Africans, we need to think more long-term and not sign bad deals for short-term gains, but think very long-term. And beneficiation is perhaps not that difficult, but we just need to change mindset. Okay, thank you very much to my distinguished panel, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Well, that's it for Brand Africa 2011. From me, Lionel Skink, and the team, it's goodbye.